My name is Grace Whitfield, and I am 42 years old. For 3 months I told myself the invitation to my father's 70th birthday gala was a peace offering, a chance for my mother to finally treat me like a daughter again instead of a mistake she kept having to explain. I was wrong. The ballroom at the Ashford Hotel smelled like white lilies and warm candle wax, the kind of smell that always meant something important was about to happen, good or bad. String lights hung low over round tables dressed in ivory linen, and a jazz trio played something soft near the bar while 200 guests in tuxedos and gowns moved through the room like they belonged there. I wore a navy dress I had bought specifically for that night, and I had my seating card in my hand, table 12, right where my mother's assistant had told me to sit weeks earlier. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was 3 steps from the table when my mother, Eleanor Whitfield, stepped in front of me with a security guard on either side of her, her diamond earrings catching the light, her voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest 4 tables to hear. She said my name had been removed from the guest list. She said there had been a mistake, that I was not supposed to be there, that I needed to leave quietly before I embarrassed the family. Behind her, my father was still shaking hands near the entrance, unaware. The guard on her left reached for my elbow. I did not move. I stood there in my navy dress holding a seating card with my own name printed on it in gold script, and 200 people slowly stopped talking. Before I tell you what happened next, and why my mother had a security guard ready to physically remove me from my own father's birthday party, tell me, what time is it where you're watching from? Where are you watching from? What's the weather like there? I'm curious how far this story will travel. The guard's hand was still on my elbow when I finally spoke. I did not raise my voice. I asked my mother, calmly, to explain to me, in front of everyone, exactly what mistake she was referring to. She did not answer. She looked past me, toward the doors, like she was waiting for someone else to arrive and finish the job she had started. That was the first time I understood this was not a mistake at all. It was planned. But to understand why my mother wanted me out of that room before my father ever knew I was there, you have to go back further, to a version of our family that most of those 200 guests never saw. I was the second daughter. My sister Vanessa was born 4 years before me, and from the beginning, she was the one my mother built her life around. My father, Charles Whitfield, spent 31 years building a mid-sized logistics company out of Charlotte, North Carolina, called Whitfield Transit Group, and by the time I was in high school it was worth roughly $18 million. My mother never worked a paying job a day in her life, but she ran our household the way she believed a company should be run, with a clear favorite and a clear disappointment. Vanessa got the debutante ball. I got told I did not have the right temperament for one. Vanessa got a car for her 16th birthday, a white Volkswagen Jetta with a bow on it in the driveway. I got a bus pass and a lecture about learning the value of hard work, delivered by my mother while Vanessa sat on the stairs eating cereal and smiling. I want to be fair here, because I did not have a clean answer for years about whether I was imagining the difference or whether it was real. Children in unequal households often doubt their own memory, because the parent doing the favoring is usually careful to keep some plausible deniability. My mother was good at that. She would take Vanessa shopping in Charlotte for 4 hours and come home with 2 bags for me from the same trip, small things, a scarf, a paperback book, just enough to say later, if I ever brought it up, that she had thought of me too. It took me until my late 20s to stop grading her love in percentages and start noticing the pattern instead. The pattern was this. Vanessa never had to ask for anything twice. When Vanessa's first marriage ended after 18 months, my mother told everyone at church it was because Vanessa was too good for that man, too special to be taken for granted, and within a year she had introduced Vanessa to Marcus Doyle, a real estate developer 12 years older with a boat and 3 commercial properties near Lake Norman. When my own engagement ended 2 years after that, to a man named Peter Hahn who I had loved without reservation for 4 years, my mother's only comment, delivered over Thanksgiving dinner while my father carved the turkey, was that maybe I was simply hard to love long-term. I remember Peter's name because I never say it out loud anymore, not because it hurts, but because for a long time I let my mother's sentence about him become the sentence I told myself about my own worth. My father was not cruel. That is important to understand, because so much of what happened later depended on the fact that Charles Whitfield genuinely believed his household was fair. He worked 11 and 12-hour days for most of my childhood, building trucking routes and warehouse contracts across 3 states, and he trusted my mother completely with what he called the emotional side of the family. He did not see the scarves and the jettas and the 2 different sentences about 2 different divorces, because he was rarely in the room when they happened. He saw a wife who managed 2 daughters and a household with what looked, from the outside, like total competence. That trust would matter enormously later, when the truth about that gala finally reached him. By the time I turned 30, I had built something my mother never expected me to build. I left Charlotte at 24 and moved to Raleigh, where I worked my way up at a commercial insurance firm called Bracken & Voss, starting as a claims associate and eventually becoming a senior underwriter with my own book of accounts worth just under $4 million a year in premiums. I bought a small brick house on Fenton Street with a yard big enough for a garden, and every spring I planted tomatoes in the same corner bed, a habit I picked up from my grandmother, my father's mother, who used to let me help her in her garden on Sundays before she passed when I was 19. The smell of tomato leaves, sharp and green and a little bitter, became the smell I associated with the only unconditional love I had ever fully trusted. I did not know yet that it would come back to me, months later, in the middle of the worst week of my adult life, as the thing that steadied my hands. My relationship with my father improved slowly during those years, mostly because distance gave us room to talk without my mother managing the conversation. He would call me on Sunday evenings, usually while walking his dog Biscuit around his neighborhood, and we would talk about the company, about a warehouse he was expanding in Greensboro, about nothing important at all. Those calls were small, but they were real, and I held on to them. My mother, meanwhile, treated my success the way she treated most things about me that did not originate from her, with a kind of polite erasure. When I made senior underwriter, she asked me at a family dinner whether insurance was really a career or just a job people did until something better came along. Vanessa, sitting across the table, had recently been named to the board of a charitable foundation my mother helped found, the Whitfield Family Foundation, and my mother spent the rest of that dinner describing Vanessa's board seat in detail no one had asked for. The foundation is where the first real crack appeared, 11 months before the gala, though I did not understand what I was looking at until much later. My father had funded the Whitfield Family Foundation with an initial $400,000 in 2019, intending it to support small business grants for veterans in the Charlotte area. Vanessa was named executive director in 2021, with a salary of $95,000 a year, which was reasonable enough on paper. What was not on paper, not anywhere my father could see it, was that Vanessa's husband Marcus had begun submitting invoices to the foundation for consulting services through a company called Doyle Strategic Partners, invoices that totaled, over 2 years, just over $210,000, for work that a forensic accountant would later determine was never performed. I found out about the invoices by accident, in a way that still feels almost too ordinary for how much it changed. I was at my mother's house in April, helping set up for Easter, and I picked up my mother's phone off the kitchen counter to move it away from a spilled glass of tea. A text notification from Vanessa was on the screen. It said, and I remember the exact wording because I photographed it before I set the phone back down, "Marcus needs Q2 invoice approved by Friday. Dad's asking questions about the grant numbers again, can you handle him?" I did not understand the full meaning of it that day. I understood 2 things. First, that Vanessa was managing something with my father that required my mother's help to hide. Second, that my mother's automatic instinct, faced with my father asking reasonable questions about his own charity, was to help her daughter make the questions go away rather than help her husband get an honest answer. I did not confront anyone that day. I want to be honest about that, because for a while I was ashamed of how long I sat on what I knew. I told myself I needed more information before I said anything, that a single text message out of context could mean almost anything, that I did not want to blow up a family relationship over a misunderstanding. Looking back, I think some part of me also knew that if I raised it too early, my mother would find a way to make me the villain of the story before my father ever saw the facts. So I waited, and I watched, and over the following months the pattern kept surfacing in small, deniable pieces. A dinner where Vanessa mentioned, a little too casually, that Marcus was thinking about winding down Doyle's strategic partners and moving into something new. A conversation with my father in July, on one of our Sunday calls, where he mentioned that the foundation's accountant, a woman named Priya Kapoor, had flagged some inconsistencies in the 2023 disbursement records and that he had asked Vanessa to walk him through them. He said Vanessa had explained it as a bookkeeping error on Priya's end. He believed her. I did not. By September, 3 months before the gala, I had started keeping my own file. Screenshots of the text I had photographed in April. Public records I pulled on Doyle's strategic partners, which showed the company had been registered in North Carolina in 2020 with no other listed clients and no business address beyond a residential property that turned out to belong to Marcus and Vanessa themselves. A copy of the Foundation's 2023 IRS Form 990, which I found through public nonprofit disclosure databases, cross-referenced against the numbers my father had mentioned to me on the phone. None of it was proof of anything criminal yet, not on its own. But it was a pattern, and patterns are what eventually convince people who do not want to be convinced. The gala invitation arrived in October, a cream envelope with my name written in my mother's handwriting, and for the first time in years I let myself believe she wanted me there simply because I was her daughter. I told myself the timing was a coincidence. It was not. I understand that now, looking back with everything I eventually learned, but at the time I let hope do what hope always does, which is talk you out of your own good instincts. The escalation started in earnest on November 3rd, when my father called me on a Tuesday afternoon instead of our usual Sunday. His voice was different, careful in a way I had rarely heard from him. He said he had asked Priya Kapoor to run a full independent audit of the Foundation's books going back to 2021, not because he suspected Vanessa specifically, but because the inconsistencies she had flagged in July had never fully resolved themselves the way Vanessa promised they would. He told me Priya was supposed to have preliminary findings by Thanksgiving. He asked me, almost offhandedly, whether I had ever noticed anything strange about Marcus's consulting arrangement with the Foundation. I told him only that I thought he was right to ask questions. I did not show my hand yet. I wanted the audit to stand on its own, independent of anything I brought to the table, so that when the truth came out, no one could say I had built it or planted it. Priya Kapoor called me directly on November 19th. I want to be clear that this was her decision, not mine, and it surprised me as much as anything else that fall. She told me later that she called because she had grown uneasy about how much pressure Vanessa and my mother were putting on her to soften the language in her preliminary report, and she wanted a second set of eyes from someone in the family who was not going to ask her to bury anything. What she had found, as of that date, was this. Between January 2021 and September 2023, Doyle's strategic partners had submitted 11 separate invoices to the Whitfield Family Foundation, totaling $211,400, for services described only as strategic advisory and community outreach consulting. Priya could find no contract specifying deliverables for any of the 11 invoices. She could find no work product, no reports, no meeting notes, nothing beyond the invoices themselves and the wire transfers approved against them. All 11 approvals had been signed by Vanessa, as executive director, with no secondary sign-off, despite the Foundation's own bylaws requiring board approval for any vendor contract exceeding $25,000 in a calendar year. Separately, and this was the piece that turned my stomach in a way the invoices had not, Priya had found that 6 veteran-owned small businesses that had been publicly listed on the Foundation's 2022 annual report as grant recipients had, in fact, received no funds at all. The Foundation's own promotional materials, which my father had proudly shown at a Rotary Club luncheon that spring, listed a bakery in Gastonia and a landscaping company in Concord among the recipients of $10,000 grants. Priya had called both businesses. Neither had ever heard of the Whitfield Family Foundation. I did not sleep well after that call. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 1 in the morning with my laptop open, cross-referencing what Priya had told me against my own file, and somewhere around midnight I found the detail that made everything click into place. Marcus Doyle's LLC, Doyle's Strategic Partners, had filed for a business line of credit in August 2023 at a regional bank, and the application, which I found referenced in a public commercial lien filing, listed the LLC's annual revenue as approximately $215,000, a figure that matched almost exactly the total of the foundation invoices. In other words, the foundation was not a side project Marcus occasionally billed. It was, functionally, his entire business. The dialogue that confirmed the family's awareness came 4 days later, on November 23, when I overheard part of a phone call between my mother and Vanessa while I was at my mother's house dropping off a casserole dish. My mother did not know I had come in through the side door, and I heard her say, quiet but sharp, "Your father cannot see Priya's final numbers before the gala. If he sees them at the party surrounded by every important person in Charlotte, he will not make a scene, he never does in public. Let him have his night, and we deal with it after." Vanessa's response, which I heard clearly through the cracked kitchen door, was, "And if Grace says something? She's been asking Dad weird questions." My mother's answer to that is the sentence I have never fully been able to forget. She said, "Then Grace doesn't get in the building." That was the turning point, though it did not feel like one in the moment. It felt like fear, plain and physical, the kind that makes your hands cold. But underneath the fear was something steadier, a decision forming without my permission. I was not going to scream at my mother in her kitchen. I was not going to call Vanessa and confront her over the phone where she could hang up and coordinate a story with my mother before I even reached my car. I decided, standing in that hallway with a casserole dish still in my hands, that whatever happened next was going to happen with documents, with a lawyer, and with witnesses who could not be talked out of what they had seen. 2 days later, I called an attorney named Diane Restrepo, a partner at a Raleigh firm who specialized in non-profit governance and fiduciary fraud, and I told her everything. Diane Restrepo listened for 40 minutes without interrupting me once, and when I finally finished, she asked only one question. She asked whether my father was aware that as the foundation's largest individual donor and its founding board chair, he had both the standing and, arguably, the fiduciary obligation to report suspected misappropriation to the North Carolina Department of the Secretary of State's Charitable Solicitation Licensing Division, and potentially to the IRS given the foundation's 501c3 status. I told her he did not know the full scope yet, only what Priya had shared in pieces. Diane's advice was simple and, at the time, harder to follow than it sounds. Do not confront anyone before the audit is finished. Do not tip off Vanessa or my mother that I knew more than they thought. Let Priya complete her report on her own timeline, get it into my father's hands through the proper channel, which was Priya herself as the foundation's retained accountant, and let the institutional process do what family conversations never could, which was produce a record no one could later deny. Priya delivered her final report to my father on December 8, 9 days before the gala, in a sealed envelope she handed him personally at his office, exactly as Diane had recommended when I passed along the suggestion through a mutual contact at Priya's firm, careful never to make it look like the two of them were coordinating with me directly. The report ran to 26 pages and included copies of all 11 Doyle Strategic Partners invoices, the wire transfer records, the 6 false grant claims, and a section titled Findings of Concern that used the phrase pattern consistent with undisclosed related party transactions and potential diversion of charitable assets 4 separate times. My father called me that night. He did not say much. He asked me how long I had known. I told him the truth, that I had suspected something since April and had been certain since Priya's call in November. He was quiet for a long time on the line, and then he said something I still think about. He said, "I built that company so neither of you would ever have to depend on anyone who didn't deserve your trust." I think I did the opposite instead. He did not cancel the gala. I did not understand that decision until the night itself. Diane later explained it to me the way she believed my father must have reasoned it through, that a cancelled party would have let my mother and Vanessa control the narrative, framing any sudden family rift as private and unprovable, something that could be smoothed over with time and selective silence the way so many things in that family always had been. My father, whatever his faults, understood one thing clearly after 31 years of running a company through recessions and lawsuits and hostile buyout attempts. Sunlight is the only thing that reliably kills a lie that has survived this long inside a family. In the 10 days before the gala, 3 institutional pieces moved into place that I only fully understood afterward. Diane filed a formal complaint on my father's behalf with the North Carolina Secretary of State's Charitable Solicitation Licensing Division on December 11, which opened an official inquiry file, number CSL 2024-11837, into the Whitfield Family Foundation's grant reporting and vendor payment practices. Separately, my father retained a litigation attorney named Robert Meyerson to prepare a civil complaint against Doyle's strategic partners and Marcus Doyle personally, seeking repayment of the $211,400 plus interest, on the grounds of breach of fiduciary duty and unjust enrichment. And Priya Kapoor, whose professional obligations required her to report suspected fraud once her findings crossed a certain threshold, filed a mandatory disclosure with the foundation's insurance carrier, which triggered an internal review that would eventually be forwarded, as these things often are, to local law enforcement for a determination on criminal referral. None of this was visible on the surface. To anyone watching from the outside, the Whitfield family looked, in that final week, exactly the way it always had. My mother sent out final gala logistics emails about valet parking and seating charts. Vanessa posted a photo on social media of the dress she planned to wear, a deep emerald gown, captioned only with a string of celebration emojis. My father continued rehearsing the toast he planned to give in his own honor, a habit I found almost unbearably sad once I understood what he already knew and was choosing to carry silently into that room. And I received my seating card, table 12, and an email from my mother's assistant confirming my attendance, sent on December 15, 2 days before the party, with no hint that anyone intended to have me removed at the door. That is the piece I did not know until I was standing in the ballroom with a guard's hand on my elbow. I did not know my mother had decided, sometime in that final week, to try to physically prevent me from being in the room when whatever she feared might happen, happened. I have thought about her reasoning many times since. I believe she convinced herself that if I simply was not there, my father would have no reason to say anything publicly, that the party could proceed as planned, image intact, and the audit could be quietly absorbed into private family business the way every other uncomfortable truth in our family had been absorbed for 40 years. She had no way of knowing that my father had already decided, on his own, sitting alone in his office 9 days earlier with Priya's report open on his desk, exactly what he intended to do with his own microphone, at his own party, in front of everyone. The guard's hand was still on my elbow when my father's voice came through the room, not from the microphone yet, but from 20 feet away, cutting through the string trio and the murmur of 200 conversations. He said one word. He said, "Stop." Everyone turned. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do before, a kind of controlled collapse, like a woman watching a wall she had spent years plastering over finally give way. My father walked across the ballroom, past tables of guests who had gone completely silent, and told the guard, calmly, to remove his hand from my arm. Then he asked me, in front of everyone, to come stand beside him at the front of the room. I want to describe what happened next exactly as it happened, because I think the calm of it is what made it so devastating. My father did not shout. He took the microphone from the MC's stand, thanked everyone for coming, and said that before he gave the toast he had planned, there was something the family needed to address honestly, because he had built his life on the belief that a man's name should mean something, and he was not willing to let that stop being true on his own birthday. He said Priya Kapoor's name. He said the number, $211,400. He said Doyle's strategic partners. He said that 6 businesses listed as grant recipients had received nothing. Vanessa stood up from her table so fast her chair scraped audibly against the floor, and she said, her voice cracking, that he was embarrassing the entire family in front of people who mattered, in front of business partners, in front of, and this is the moment the room truly went still, in front of Governor Ellen Marsh, who was seated at table 3 as a longtime family friend and one of Whitfield Transit Group's earliest civic supporters. It was Governor Marsh who interrupted, not to defend Vanessa, but to stand and speak directly to my father. She said she had known Charles Whitfield for close to 20 years, and that she had personally written a letter of recommendation for the Whitfield Family Foundation's state charitable registration in 2019, staking her own name to its integrity. She said that if what he was describing was accurate, she wanted it stated plainly, in front of her, because she took it as seriously as anyone in that room. There is no way to overstate what that moment did. It removed, in a single sentence from someone with nothing personally at stake, every last thread of deniability my mother and Vanessa had been counting on. Marcus Doyle left through a side exit before my father finished speaking. My mother sat down at an empty table alone and did not speak again for the rest of the night. The consequences arrived over the following 4 months, methodically, the way Diane had promised they would. The North Carolina Secretary of State's inquiry, File CSL 2024-11837, concluded in February with a finding of material misrepresentation in the Foundation's charitable filings, resulting in the revocation of the Whitfield Family Foundation's solicitation license and a referral to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office. Marcus Doyle was charged in March with felony embezzlement and obtaining property by false pretenses, and in a plea agreement reached in June, he was ordered to repay the full $211,400 in restitution, sentenced to 18 months of active probation, and barred from serving as an officer or director of any nonprofit registered in the state for 10 years. Vanessa was not criminally charged, since prosecutors determined her role was one of willful blindness rather than direct fraud, but she resigned as executive director in January and was named, along with Marcus, in my father's civil suit, which settled in May for full repayment plus $60,000 in legal costs. My mother faced no legal consequence at all. Her consequence was smaller and, I think, in some ways heavier. My father asked her, in March, for a legal separation after 39 years of marriage. I did not attend the sentencing hearing in June, though Diane told me it happened exactly the way these things usually do, quietly, in a courtroom with fluorescent lighting and nothing dramatic about it at all. I spent that afternoon in my garden on Fenton Street instead, kneeling in the dirt, planting tomatoes the way my grandmother taught me, and when I stood up and smelled that same sharp green smell on my hands, I understood something I had not let myself understand before. Justice, when it finally comes, rarely feels like the movie version. It felt, mostly, like quiet. My father and I talk every Sunday now, not because a family crisis forced us into it, but because we choose to. He sold his stake in Whitfield Transit Group's foundation entirely and started a much smaller scholarship fund instead, one he administers personally, with no executive director, no invoices he cannot see with his own eyes. My mother and I speak twice a year, on holidays, briefly, and I have made peace with the fact that this is likely all that relationship will ever be. Forgiveness, I have come to believe, is something you can offer freely, on your own terms, without ever handing someone the keys back to your life. Forgiveness is personal, but access must be earned. I think about that ballroom sometimes, the lilies and the candle wax and the guard's hand on my elbow, and I ask myself what I would have done if my father had not called my name. I do not have a clean answer. I would like to think I would have walked out with my head up either way. What I know for certain is that I would not have stayed silent forever, and I wonder, watching this, whether you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and telling the truth in a room that badly did not want to hear it. Which one did you choose, and would you choose it again? Thank you for watching. Everything in this video is fictional, made only for entertainment and reflection. If it stayed with you at all, let it be for this, that healing rarely looks like a courtroom or a microphone. It looks like a quiet Sunday phone call, or a garden, and the boundary you finally decided you were allowed to keep.